Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now we welcome you into the portion of Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitled Talkin' Liberty. It's when we welcome back in our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, and LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, Scott D. Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim.
Okay, impeachment. We have covered most of the political waterfront on impeachment. There's limited things about the law that you have to know, but whatever it is that we need to know about the legal process, tell us that now.
Well, I think the most important thing is just for people as they process it is to remember this is not a criminal charge like in a state trial court, whether that would be for something small like shoplifting or big like homicide. And as we hear talk about the different rules that may apply, it is still and always will be different from an actual criminal trial proceeding.
Now, this is just an inquiry.
Excuse me for laughing.
Which to me, though,
inquiry.
In a way, it seems that an inquiry gives you all the drawbacks of voting on impeachment without any of the benefits, which means that you're not voting to impeach the president, and yet you're now on record as if you were. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand, and that does not make a whole lot. That's more of the political analysis side, I think. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. I feel like a bill of impeachment should be put forth or not.
And the reason I didn't ask you to speak much about it is because impeachment, lest we have forgotten or are unaware of it, is a political process.
There's a limited legal framework that it has to exist in, but that's exactly right. It's anybody, any member of Congress, it's up to them in their own judgment as to what conduct is impeachable.
They and they alone.
Yes.
And each house, each individual Congress, the 2-year period of that Congress, 110th, 115th, whatever, they set the rules. And the minority has no power. Virtually none, because it's a majority vote, so all you have to do is hold the majority.
That's the only important thing, is that vote.
Exactly. Okay. They want to impeach Trump, but at the same time, they've been laying out an alternate strategy, which is death by 1,000 cuts. And now one of those cuts is trying to revoke the liquor licenses for Trump's golf courses in New Jersey from prominent Garden State Democrats.
So Phil Murphy is the name of the Democrat governor of New Jersey who appointed the Democrat attorney general, a man named Gurbir Grewal. And he's the one, in his capacity as attorney general, who's in charge of the alcohol beverage kind of laws and their enforcement, their regulation. And there's one country club that Trump has that served somebody who was then in a fatal accident. They didn't kill themselves. They killed their own father, who was sitting next to them in the car. It was on an afternoon, and they alleged that the driver was overserved at the country club. As you might imagine, Tim, places that sell a lot of liquor, sometimes they sell liquor to somebody who then gets into a car crash, and including a fatal one. There are some host liability laws that cover these instances. That, it's incumbent upon those people, generally speaking, who serve alcohol not to serve to somebody who is obviously intoxicated or they should have known was obviously intoxicated. But the thing I think that's funny here, Tim, is that they went right to the death penalty in terms of the licensure, which is not that it should be suspended or some kind of re-education.
Revoked.
Pull it. And here's the other thing. If you lose one of your licenses in New Jersey as a liquor license,
you lose all of them.
You lose them all.
Yep.
So the several other country clubs that are and as you you might imagine, that's how they make their money, right? They sell booze for all these wedding receptions and things like that. You can't probably keep afloat if you lose that business.
If you can't beat him in the political process, you can at least reach into his pocket and make him pay.
I think it's a real testament to the lengths that Governor Murphy and General Grewal will go to use their the power that's been granted to them by the people to advance the people's wants and needs, Tim, and instead punish their private enemy, Donald Trump, for their own political gain. This is, they're the ones that are getting the plus points from the Twitterverse and so forth for this effort to frustrate Donald Trump.
I'm sorry if this seems like a rhetorical question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you make of whatever merits there are in this case? And is this a revocation of liquor licenses that would have occurred if they weren't owned by a guy named Donald Trump?
Absolutely not. If they weren't owned by a guy named Donald Trump, this is a non-issue. Maybe that license would have been subject to suspension, given the facts of the case. We don't know, and we can never know, because Attorney General Girwal and Mayor Murphy have both really sullied their own offices and their own oaths when they turn them against a political enemy for political gain.
Let's move south to Georgia, where a judge has laid down the law to a sheriff saying he is not allowed to put up signs in the yards of sex offenders.
Even sex offenders have rights, Tim, and the Butts County Sheriff Gary Long, every year now for the past several years, has tried to basically put up these signs that denigrate the homes of where people registered sex offenders are and try to scare people away from them on trick-or-treating. Now, the thing is, those signs involve trespassing on the person's property and placing a sign that they don't want on their lawn. Not to mention the fact that the people who've been registered as sex offenders in that county, they're not necessarily registered as sex offenders because they predated on a youth in the neighborhood. That's not how a lot of these cases are dealt with. So,
can you be more specific about who beyond the pedophile and the more notorious sex offenders that we know about are considered sex offenders? What other crimes
probably
make someone a sex
offender? One of the
offender?
largest classes of those crimes involve people who are in relationships with somebody who's not a child while they're an adult, but for somebody who is a younger teen while they're an older teen or a young adult. And as you may imagine, the parent, often of a younger girl, finds out about these romantic relationships and then blows a whistle on them, and the man is branded a sex offender, when in reality it's an arrangement or a relationship that society may deem inappropriate. But I think that all would agree in sort of the cold light of day that it's wrong to brand that person. And this is part of the reason why it's so troubling, because they're going to have lifelong consequences like this, which is a sheriff who wants to shame them. And you can imagine how ridiculous it would be if 30 years previously somebody had a shoplifting conviction, and the sheriff went around and followed them to retail stores and said, hey, that guy's a shoplifter.
I think the thing with sex offenders that distinguishes them from others is the widespread perception, and perhaps the truth, that these people cannot be cured of this. They cannot be changed into someone normal.
Tim, I have to agree with you that, and you combine that with the abject terrified state that people are in about the well-being of their kids when they send them out into the world. And I think that you have to say, at the risk of being called a cynic, Tim, that it's the sheriff's, getting some free political hit off of these offenders by pretending to be really on the ball.
Now, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but I have noticed a pattern here. It's a remarkable coincidence you, a child of Philadelphia, seem to bring forward a Philadelphia story on Talkin' Liberty virtually every week. And this week, it's the Philly Defenders Association asking a court to declare police incapable of smelling marijuana. And, I read some of the stuff on this. It has a very pungent, distinct smell. I've smelled it a couple of times in my life. How would you get that wrong? And yet you're saying, it's like 10% of the sense of smelling it by the police is actual marijuana?
The numbers are what's saying it. What's fascinating about this story, this is a kind of run-of-the-mill case where somebody's challenging some evidence but the reasoning behind it is why it's fascinating and interesting, Tim. And I think it may have actually some legs and maybe some national reach. The Philadelphia Defenders Association was granted some raw data from the Philadelphia Police Department to understand how many cars they stopped and how many they then searched because they said they smelled marijuana. This, Tim, is a very to say that it's a long-standing trouble point for liberty activists is an understatement, because what's the history here from the liberty activist side is there's a long-standing perception that police officers simply say that they smell marijuana because it's an untested. It's basically a get into search free card for them. They say it, they're able to search. Nobody's ever going to refute that they didn't smell the marijuana. Well, that's what's finally
happening. Right, because that's something you can't prove, right? My senses told me there's marijuana. I guess they were wrong, but you can't prove that the person lied, right? And yet only 10% of the time?
Well, that's what's news, and that's what has been proven.
That's stunning.
The numbers don't. What the numbers show is that these police, you can either have your pick, Tim. Either A, they're simply not good smellers of marijuana. So when they think they smell marijuana, they're not actually smelling it.
Even though they're trained, and they may even have dogs that know how to smell it.
Tim, they're human beings. They live in America. They know what pot smells like.
Of course they do.
They're adults. Or they're gaming it in order to get into people's cars and search when they're not legally able to do so. An illegal pretext. You're right. There are two kinds. And I think that this will show that it's an illegal one. I bring the story to the table, Tim, because I think it really may have legs given the data that they have to back. It's one thing to be able to stand up in court and say, we know, Your Honor, they didn't smell marijuana. It's another thing to say, well, they said that it's a legal justification, the smell, but we have the data that proves, whether by hook or crook, they can't smell this stuff.
I think when 90% of your stops where you smelled something turned out not to produce what you smelled, let's just put it this way, to say it stokes suspicion of the motives would be an understatement.
Not to mention the fact that there are now jurisdictions not too far from Pennsylvania where a person may legally consume marijuana.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
And thank you for joining us. That is it for this week's show, but we'll be back at you next week. A reminder that you can pick up the podcast of this program at libertynation.com, where you can also download one or both of our podcasts, The Uprising with Scott and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with Mark Angelides. All of it available at libertynation.com. So until next week, this is Tim Donner saying, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.